My name is Hans-Martin von Gardeker, and I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the organizing committee of the DSE conference, which includes John Ress, Bertel Tscherning, probably didn't pronounce that correctly, as well as the next one, Fedor Ishkakov, wherever he is, back there, Philip Eisenhower, David Koll, and myself. I already said that at the beginning of the summer school, which has been going for 3 days now, but it's just an amazing feeling to be in a room with 40 people again, all vibrant atmosphere, everybody excited about structural research. And we've had now quite some experience over the last 3 days as part of the summer school with a hybrid format. So I'd also like to welcome already our first panelist, Mike Keane, and the others who will speak during the rest of the conference, who are there already, Joe Mullins, Hamish Lowe, and Orazio Attanasio. Yeah, and we'll have many more people joining in online, and the hybrid format so far has worked really, really well. I hope this continues to be the case for the next 2 days and 2 more days of summer school. I just want to thank our sponsors, which is financially the CRC EPOS 224 Transregio. Yeah, this long name is a collaborative effort between the universities of Mannheim and Bonn. It's funded by the German Research Foundation very generously over a period of 4 years. We've just put in the bid to for a renewal of another 4 years, and we very much hope we can continue these efforts. So they are funding almost the entire endeavor. We'd also like to thank the Econometric Society, which is sponsoring this series of conferences and which makes it possible, I think, to have this great lineup of people around and on a regular basis. And you could just tell that even with this hybrid format and everybody's still a bit, yeah, does that work out and so on, that you could tell that it helped to have this as a series which had been running for 4 years, I believe. So now I'd like to welcome you to the very first session of the conference, which includes Mike Keane as the first speaker, David Koll as the second one, and Thomas Jørgensen as the third one. Everybody has 40 minutes, including discussion. We will moderate the discussion via Zulip, so you should have gotten a link if you're participating online to our Zulip chat. So please just ask your question there. And I will either take the liberty of interrupting the speaker or postpone it to the end and ask it then.
Okay, so hi everybody. This paper is called Health Shocks and the Evolution of Earnings Over the Life Cycle. It's joint with Elena Capatina at the ANU and Shiko Maruyama at UTS. The goal of the paper is to evaluate the contribution of health shocks to life cycle earnings inequality. So what we're going to do is use the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey, or MEPS, to estimate laws of motion for health shocks and health, and also to estimate the distribution of health shock costs. Secondly, we're then going to build health and health shocks into a life cycle labor supply model with human capital. And then we're going to combine the laws of motion that we've estimated here with the structural model in order to simulate how health shocks affect earnings and earnings inequality. Now, the really key point here is that health shocks have 3 different kinds of effects. There are 3 ways they affect earnings. So there are direct effects. A health shock could directly reduce earnings by reducing work hours, by generating sick days. A health shock can also reduce health, which reduces your productivity and thereby directly reduces earnings. On the other hand, there's indirect effects operating through human capital. So if there's a learning by doing human capital mechanism and health shock reduces your work hours, then you're going to be accumulating human capital at a slower rate, and that's going to reduce your future wages. So that's an additional channel through which it affects earnings. Then finally, we have what we call behavioral effect of health shocks. Now, if you think about an environment like the US, where you don't have universal insurance, but instead, so uninsured people who don't have insurance through their employer could be subject to high healthcare costs if they do suffer from shocks. But there does exist in the U.S. a means-tested transfer program, the Medicaid program that would cover your healthcare costs if you're poor enough. So one example of behavioral effect is that low-skilled workers might have an incentive in this environment to curtail their labor supply and their human capital investment in order to maintain eligibility for means-tested social insurance that would cover their costs of healthcare. So this lack of insurance, therefore, can create this perverse behavioral incentive to curtail your labor supply and your human capital investment. Now, we're able to assess in the model these three different kinds of effects using three different kinds of experiments. So we can simulate the direct effect of health shocks by simulating the impact of a health shock on earnings, holding your human capital fixed along its baseline path that it would have followed if you hadn't had the health shock. Then we can estimate the human capital effect by doing that same simulation, but then allowing human capital to adjust and determining the additional decline in earnings that occurs as a result of the slower human capital accumulation. Now, in both of these kinds of experiments, we're holding people's decision rules fixed. We're holding decision rules for labor supply and consumption fixed. We can then evaluate behavioral effects of health risks by simulating how workers would behave in a different environment where there is no risk of health shocks. Now, if you take away not just health shocks, but create an environment where people don't perceive any risk of health shocks, they'll then re-optimize to the new situation. So their decision rules for labor supply and consumption will adapt. And that will take away, for example, this perverse incentive to curtail labor supply to maintain eligibility for means-tested transfers that I mentioned earlier. Okay, now let me just highlight a couple findings. We find that the impact of health shocks is greatly amplified by human capital accumulation. To give an example, we find that for a 40-year-old male college graduate, if a major persistent health shock occurs at the age of 40, that this would reduce the present value of remaining lifetime earnings by $45,000 or 4.5%. We estimate that 40% of that impact is due to the knock-on effect of reduced human capital accumulation after the shock, whereas 60% of it is due to the direct effects. Now, we also find that the behavioral impact of health risk is large. So our model implies that this incentive to curtail labor supply and human capital accumulation by low-skilled workers in the U.S. environment is rather substantial. And as a result of that, we simulate that the provision of public health insurance would take away that perverse incentive and substantially increase the labor supply and human capital accumulation of low-skilled workers. We actually find that between the extra tax revenue you get because of that increase in labor supply, combined with the reduced program costs, reduced means-tested transfers, that introducing insurance coverage for the uninsured, publicly financed, would largely pay for itself in this model. Now, another key finding is that health shocks account for 15% of lifetime's earnings inequality for US males, and that 2/3 of that effect is due to the behavioral response. But as I mentioned, there's this, the existence of health risks creates this incentive for low-skilled workers to reduce their earnings, and that shifts out the left tail of the earnings distribution to the left and increases inequality. Okay, now I won't have time to cover the various literature that this paper contributes to, but I'll just give the names there for the video. So let me just give you the overview of the model quickly. So it's a life cycle labor supply model with both human capital and health capital. Individuals enter the model at age 25. They face survival risk each period. They live to a maximum of 100 years. Both human capital and health affect wage offers. There's learning by doing human capital accumulation. Very importantly, job offers in the model may or may not come with employer-provided health insurance. There are two decisions in the model. There's a discrete labor supply decision, full-time, part-time, or not work, and there's a continuous consumption saving decision. We don't model retirement. We just impose that everyone has to retire at age 65. You could retire earlier. Heterogeneity in the model. Education is treated as exogenous. We don't model that. There's 3 observed types: the less than or equal to high school type, the some college type, and the college type. We let both the offer wage function and the health process parameters differ flexibly by education. And then we have latent productivity types, similar to the Keane 97 sort of setup. Right? Health shocks in the model play 3 roles. They generate medical treatment costs, they reduce work hours by generating sick days, and they reduce your health and life expectancy. The model contains different varieties of health shocks that differ in terms of their persistence and their predictability. We also model health as having 2 dimensions. There's what we call functional health, which affects your current productivity, and that's going to be modeled as just, we'll call that H, and it's either poor, average, or good. And then there's also latent health risk that affects your risks of health shocks. This is like whether you have hypertension or not. And again, we construct that to be, low, average, or high. The MEPS data contains about 1,000 condition codes for different kind of health events. And we take those codes and use them to classify health shocks by their impact on productivity, by their predictability, and by their persistence. Now, I'm certainly not going to explain here all the details of how we do that, as it's rather involved. Let me just say that we, in addition to the stocks of health, which are H and R, that I already mentioned, there's going to be 3 types of health shocks. There's DP shocks, which are predictable persistent shocks, and DU shocks that are unpredictable persistent shocks. So a predictable persistent shock, that would maybe be something like a heart attack, which is predictable if you're overweight or have hypertension, and it has a persistent effect on your productivity. An unpredictable shock might be some form of cancer that is not predictable based on past history. And then we also have unpredictable transitory shocks. These transitory shocks do not feed into future H, whereas the persistent shocks do. Okay, now so the state variables in the model are your functional health H, your risk level R. There's a 1-0 indicator for disability status. We model disability in a very simple way. The people in poor health are probabilistically eligible for disability benefits. The stock of human capital, and when I say that here, that really means work experience, stock of assets, and then the time invariant state variables, which are your education and productivity type. I already mentioned the decisions. Medical costs are determined by your health shocks. The way we model it is if those costs occur, you have to pay them. So medical spending is not a choice here. Now, let me just describe the timing of the model. So you start the period or year knowing your state, which is your functional health, your risk level, your human capital level, your assets, and your disability status, then you get an employment offer. Now, the employment offer consists of a wage offer, an offered level of hours, and whether the job comes with insurance or not. And the probability that you get different kinds of offers depends on your education level. All right, so basically, higher skilled workers are more likely to get high wage full-time job offers that come with insurance. Right, so the high wage workers or high skill workers are more likely to get good job offers. The low skill workers, on the other hand, are more likely to get, job offers that don't come with insurance. Once you get your offer, you decide whether to accept or reject it. Right? Now, after that decision, your health shocks are revealed. The cost of those shocks is revealed. So your medical expenditures are revealed. Your sick days are revealed. Obviously, since this is in effect a sort of insurance model where you're deciding whether to be, to some extent, you're deciding whether or not to be insured in terms of which offers you accept or reject. So obviously you want the shocks to be realized after the insurance decision's made. Then finally you make your consumption decision, and then next period state is revealed. Now, the wage offer function in the model is standard. As I said, we just have wage offers that depend on your work experience. But in addition, so aside from the fact that it depends on your human capital, it also depends on your health level. So that's what's somewhat different here. And wage offers differ between full and part-time jobs. And of course, as I said earlier, we let all of these parameters of the wage function differ by your education level, right? And in addition to the part of the wage function that depends on education, human capital, health, and hours, there's also your latent productivity type, and there is a transitory shock to wages. So as I emphasize, health here can directly affect wages through these terms. Now the way we set it up, since you get this offer, which fixes your wage, and it fixes the hours you've committed to work for, right? So when you get a health shock, which might affect your health, which enters your wage function, that's not going to affect your wage until the next period, because you've already contracted in for the current wage. But it could reduce your hours in the current period below this contracted level because it generates sick days. Let me see. Okay, this slide just explains that in addition to the shocks I've just described, we also allow for persistent shocks to your human capital level. So the way human capital evolves is you take your current human capital, you add the number of hours you work to it, and then you hit it with a shock. And that's how it evolves. We model it in such a way that if you're employed, you're more likely to get a positive shock to human capital, whereas if you're not employed, you're much more likely to get a negative shock to human capital. So that through that mechanism, your employment status has some persistent effect on your evolution of human capital. Let me see. So in terms of the medical expenditures, as I said, we fit that distribution from the MEPS data. And the way we model health insurance in the model is there's three kinds. If your employer provides insurance, it's going to cover 70% of your medical expenses. If you're not covered by your employer and you do get sick and and the cost of that illness drives you below a consumption floor, then you would, then we assume that there's a government program, you could call it Medicaid, that's going to pay your medical costs to bring you up to that consumption floor. On the other hand, if you are retired at the age of 65, you're then eligible for the Medicare program, which is going to pay half of the medical costs for retirees. Okay, now the way we model means tested transfers here as captured by a consumption floor, that's in the tradition of the well-known Hubbard Skinner Zeldis JPE paper from back in '95. And the way that I said we have a simple model of disability insurance, all it does in this model is it increases your consumption floor. And as it's calibrated, it actually increases it rather substantially. Okay, so this consumption floor, it's really meant to capture the whole array of programs like Medicaid and food stamps and so on that exist in the US. Okay, so we have the utility function. It's a CRRA nesting of a consumption leisure aggregate. Which is quite standard in this literature. Okay, so let me, as I said, the model's calibrated to the US male population. We're going to use the MEPS data from 2000 to 2012. We intentionally stop in 2012 because after that you had the Affordable Care Act come in, and that made some major changes to the environment. This data has information on medical expenditures. We also have to get data on wages, employment, assets, and for that we use other data sets like the CPS, PSID, MEPS, and CEX. I mentioned yesterday, I was talking 2 days ago in the lecture, I was talking about the beauties of method of simulated moments estimation. Another great thing about method of simulated moments estimation is you can combine moments from different data sources when one data source doesn't have all the information you need, and that's what we're doing here. Okay, so so the big picture of how the calibration works is we're using the MEPS data to estimate how health shocks affect health, sick days, and medical costs. And then we're going to use the structural model that we fit to all these data sets to assess how these above exogenous factors affect life cycle earnings. Therefore, by combining the two, we can forecast how health shocks affect the present value of earnings using the 3 kinds of experiments I discussed earlier. Okay, so let me just start giving you some results. Hans, can you tell me how much time there is? I've completely lost track because of the late start.
It's about half time.
Oh, that's all. Okay. Okay, good. First thing we're going to do with the model is simulate the impact of what we're going to call a major unpredictable persistent health shock. That's what we're calling a DU shock. So this is a DU shock that causes your health to deteriorate in the next period. In our model, health evolves deterministically. So a DU shock, it raises the probability your health deteriorates, but your health doesn't have to deteriorate. So we're defining a major shock as a DU shock that causes health to deteriorate. And such shocks have a 6.3% annual frequency for men aged 50 to 60 in the MEPS. Now, for example, if such a shock occurs at age 50, we predict a cumulative earnings loss of $40,000 over the next 10 years. And as a point of comparison, James Smith estimates cumulative income losses of $37,000 over 10 years following major health shocks for men in the Health and Retirement Survey. So we were kind of happy with that because it indicates that our model at least maps health shocks into earnings losses in a plausible looking way. Now, of course, Smith doesn't really need a model to do this, but where we do need a model now is if we want to decompose that $40,000 or $37,000 into the part that we call the direct effect versus the part that we're calling the human capital accumulation effect. All right. Here's what it kind of looks like if you do that. What we're plotting here is a full-time wage offer. This is an annual earnings offer, annual wage offer, plotted against age. So here's age 50, 51, and so on. What we're plotting, the blue line is a baseline simulated path for a particular person of their wage path in the baseline where there's no shock. And then we simulate a major health shock occurring to them at age 50. Okay. Now remember, in the model, it's rigged up so that that can't reduce your earnings until the next year at age 51. So this red line is the simulated path given the shock. Now, we now have a dotted red line and a solid red line. The dotted red line is showing you the direct effect. It's showing you what happens if we constrain their human capital to continue to evolve as it did along the baseline path. And you see that in that case, people rather quickly, after about 5 years, have their offer wages pretty much recover. On the other hand, if we allow for the human capital accumulation effect to also matter, so that we're not holding human capital fixed along its baseline path, then you see that offer wages never do quite recover. They remain persistently below the baseline path. And so the human capital effect generates a long run drop in offer wages. And in this case, this increases the present value of earnings loss by about 20%. Remember, earlier I said that for a 40-year-old person, it would reduce it by 40%. Now it's just 20. That's because the person's older. So there's a less of a horizon over which these losses accumulate. Okay. Now, what I want to do now is do an experiment where we're going to eliminate health shocks at working ages. This is because, I should say, we want to do an experiment to determine the effect of health shocks on earnings inequality. And we want to be able to isolate, again, the direct effect versus the knock-on effect from human capital. And we also want to, and then in addition, we want to isolate the behavioral effect. Okay, so we're gonna do an experiment where we eliminate health shocks at working ages from 25 to 64. And in the first experiment, we're gonna hold the people's decision rules for labor supply and consumption fixed. So this first experiment, as I said in the very beginning, that will isolate just the direct effect of the health shocks and the additional effect operating through human capital. But it won't tell you the behavioral effect of health risk. In the second experiment, when we eliminate health shocks, we're going to allow the decision rules for labor supply and consumption to adapt to the new environment. And that is going to allow us to determine the behavioral effect of the health risk. Okay. So here's what happens when you do these experiments to the Gini coefficient for income by age. So the blue line is the baseline, and you're starting at age 25. Here's the Gini inequality coefficient plotted on the vertical axis. And as you would expect, as people age, as the population ages, the inequality is growing in the cross-section. Now, if we shut down health shocks but hold decision rules fixed in order to isolate just the direct and human capital effects, then we get this dashed line. So without health shocks occurring, again, not surprisingly, there's less growth in inequality over the life cycle. So the difference between these two lines is telling you, that gap is telling you how much of this increase in inequality over the life cycle is due to the impact of the health shocks. Now, then when we allow decision rules for labor supply and consumption to also adapt to this new environment where there's no risk of health shocks, you see that inequality drops quite a bit more. Don't be deceived. The bottom line on this, the bottom of the y-axis is 0.3. You know, this isn't going to 0 here. It's dropping, but it is, you're getting a much more substantial drop than you do from just the direct effects. So this is telling you that the people's behavioral responses to health risk, how it affects their labor supply, for instance, is generating a significant increase in inequality over the life cycle. Now, we simulate that when we do this experiment of eliminating health shocks at working ages while holding decision rules fixed, the Gini earnings inequality measure, you know, averaged over people of all ages, decreases by 4.9%. From 0.304 to 0.289. But if you further allow decision rules to adapt, the Gini drops by quite a bit more. It now drops by 15% from 0.304 to 0.258. So this 15% drop is why I told you in the beginning that health shocks generate about 15% of inequality in the present value of lifetime earnings for men. And the difference between this 5% and this 15% is why I told you in the beginning that the direct effect of health shocks on health and productivity account for only about 1/3 of their impact on inequality, while the behavioral responses account for 2/3. Now, much of this paper is devoted to understanding kind of what these behavioral channels that account for this are. Okay. Now, let me look at this a different way. So I'm gonna, in this table, I'm gonna look at the effects of health shocks on the present value of lifetime earnings. And I'm gonna look at this for different kinds of people. So in the model, we have these different types of people. So within the high school type, there are 3 latent productivity types. There's low, medium, and high latent productivity. And you can see the mean of the present value of lifetime earnings for each of those 3 types. You see they're quite different. So, you know, similar to the finding in my paper with Ken back in '97, this model is implying that latent productivity type is accounting for a large part of the inequality in lifetime earnings. I told you that in the beginning that health shocks account for about 15% of inequality in the present value of lifetime earnings in this model, but the differences in latent productivity type account for like, you know, 80%, 70%, a huge fraction. And you can see that here. So, you know, the low productivity type within the high school type has a present value of lifetime earnings of 293,000, but the high productivity type within the high school type has a much higher present value of lifetime earnings of $734,000, right? Now, within the some college type, we also have low and high productivity latent types, and within the college type, we also have low and high productivity latent types. Now, let's look at let's look at, say, this college high productivity type. So these people have a present value of lifetime earnings of $1.5 million. Right? Now, that's in the baseline. If you do an experiment where you eliminate health shocks at working ages, but you hold their decision rules fixed at the baseline. So you don't let their decision rules for labor supply and consumption change. You force them to do the same, but you eliminate their health shocks. Now, so what you could imagine is happening is these people are still living in a world with health shocks, but they're just getting lucky and no health shocks are ever happening to them, okay? But they still act as if the risk is there. Now, if you do that experiment of eliminating health shocks, the present value of lifetime earnings of these people goes up 3.26%. Now, that's what you'd expect. You know, they're healthier because they're healthy. They're going to have a bit less sick days, and so their earnings go up a bit. Now, let's let their decision rules adapt. So now they realize they're living in an environment where they're not going to have any health shocks, and they act accordingly. Now, for these high skill, high income people, we see that there's almost no effect. In fact, their earnings now drop slightly, very slightly. Now, why are their earnings dropping slightly? Well, these high income people, they're doing some precautionary saving to, you know, because they know they're going to have co-pays and so on. So they're doing some precautionary saving to self-insure against health shocks in the baseline environment. When you take away any risk of health shocks, they don't need to do that anymore. And so they work a little less and their consumption goes down a little bit. But you see, it's really not a big deal at all.
So I've so far, postponed most questions, but there's one by Hamish, which is directly related to the interpretation of this table, namely whether there's a correlation between productivity types and health risk.
Between the latent productivity types, you mean?
Yes.
Actually, there isn't. That's a good point. I mean, in this, the way we've set it up, the health risk only differs by your education level. We haven't allowed health risk to differ by latent productivity type. That's a very interesting point, actually. So we'll definitely look into that. We're working on revising this paper right now. One of the things we're doing is adding more types, so it'd be a good opportunity to look at that. Now let me go now to the opposite extreme. I want to look at the lowest skill type in the model. So this is the high school and less than high school type, and the low productivity type within that group. Okay. Now, so these people have a mean lifetime earnings of $294,000. Okay. When we shut down their health shocks while holding their decision rules fixed, their present value of lifetime earnings goes up by 13%. Now, notice that that's a much bigger effect than you saw for the very high skill people. So for these low skill types, you see that the direct effect of health shocks is having a much bigger negative effect on their lifetime earnings. And so when you get rid of the direct effect of health shocks, their lifetime earnings goes up much more than for the high skill types. Okay, so this alone is telling you that there's some inequality being generated by direct effect of health shocks. Right, that difference is telling you that the direct effect of health shocks generates inequality. Now let's look what happens when we allow these people's decision rules to change. Now, as I told you, these low skill, low productivity types in this model have an incentive to curtail their labor supply and their human capital accumulation in order to maintain eligibility for means tested transfers. When we allow their decision rules to adapt to this new environment where health risk doesn't exist, we're taking away that incentive. And you see that as a result, they work a lot more, and hence their earnings goes up a lot, right? You see a very big 37% increase in earnings for these people. And that is why when you shut down these behavioral effects of health shocks, you get a significant reduction in inequality. Now,
5 minutes left, Mike, in case we want to have a discussion.
Yeah. Now, at this point, I can easily stop because I have a lot more slides. But what I've shown you right here shows you the essential mechanism that's going on in the model. So this is really sort of our key point. Everything that's going on that I talked about in the beginning, all the results sort of follow from this key mechanism, okay? I just want to show you that you could do another experiment where you don't eliminate health shocks, but only eliminate the financial costs of health shocks, right? And it's interesting to compare that to what happens if you eliminate health shocks. So if you eliminate health shocks altogether, it increases the employment rate of these low skill high school types substantially from 57% to 84%. But if all you do is eliminate the financial costs of health shocks, their work still increases substantially from 57% to 71%, almost as much. And that is why, that's why we can see that the reason they're working less is to a great extent due to this incentive to maintain eligibility to means tested transfers that cover these financial costs, right? And so I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you. So let's give Mike a hand. There's one question by Eric, a couple by Joe and Orazio, so they can go for it themselves in a second. Eric is asking for a slightly rephrase, so he might have misunderstood the state variable slides because he was expecting health insurance to be there as a state variable. Was it not in there because you get a new draw every period? In which case it should still be a state variable, and he could see an important risk as being not having health insurance and knowing you're unlikely to have it in the future.
So in this model, you draw your insurance. You get new wage offers every period. So you this combination offer of a wage, an hours level, and an insurance status of the job, you get new draws for that every period. There's still a lot of persistence in those draws because the probabilities, college types are pretty much always going to have an offer available with insurance, right? So there's going to be a lot of persistence in them having insurance. And conversely, the kind of low-skilled high school types are going to have low probability of getting such offers, and there's going to be low persistence in them having coverage.
Excellent, thanks. Joe, do you want to go for it directly?
Sure, thanks, Hans-Martin. There was a lot of really interesting stuff in here, Mike. I think there's certainly a lot you could do with this model. You seem to avoid any discussion of welfare or consumption, at least in what we saw today.
There is discussion of welfare. It's actually kind of pushed to the end of the paper.
Got it.
Yeah.
But
we look at we try to rig up an experiment where we provide insurance to the uninsured, and we do it in a kind of like a balanced budget simulation where it's covered by tax increases, and we look at the welfare impact of that.
Cool. Yeah, I think I noticed in table 13, or in the table you just showed us, I think those were consumption valuations or something right next to.
Those were coefficients of variation of earnings.
Okay.
But there are,
well,
but there are consumption
very
equivalent. Oh, that's a good point.
interpretation.
CEV can mean two things. Okay.
Okay.
There are
Thanks
the
for
other
clarifying.
CEVs somewhere at the end. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mike. Anyway, great talk. Really interesting.
Cool. Orazio, one last question.
Yeah, Mike, that was a really interesting presentation. Your model does a lot of really useful things. I have two questions. One is kind of minor and more technical, and the other one might be more substantive. The first question was, it seems to me that an important channel, if I understand the working on the model correctly in determining all these effects in table 13, is the persistence that is generated by various aspects of the model. So my question there is whether the offer, people get an offer every period, does that depend on their previous status? So if you are in a good job, you're more likely to stay there next period. So that's the probability, and that's probably true across that. And you know, that's a minor detail, but it could be important to generate the persistence that in turn generates some of the results. And my second question, which is more substantive, if I understand well what you presented, one potentially important channel that is missing, you see, all these behavioral responses, which seems to be big and they're interesting, are driven by the incentives that low productivity guys have to keep insurance, which is fine. And that's an interesting channel. But I guess what you're assuming in the model, if I understand it, is that people know the health process and they act accordingly. What is missing in the model is that whether health has a, you know, is it complementary in providing utility to consumption? And more importantly, do people invest in health? So if you have high cholesterol, you change your diet, and do stuff around that. And probably responses in the populations are very different across types. They're probably much less rational, if you want, the low types in terms of you know, doing exercise and eating healthily, and which suggests me that there could be some misperceptions about the health process, and therefore the investment are going down. And so I was wondering whether you can extend the model to encapsulate these other channels to.
Let me tell you, right now we're undertaking a major revision of the paper. And the main thing we're doing, the important thing we're doing is we're introducing a decision about treatment and about whether to pay your healthcare costs. So, you know, basically listening to criticisms we've had of the paper over the years, we've internalized those criticisms and try to distill what's the key criticism. And I think the key criticism is, and I agree with this, the assumption that you just have to pay these costs. The costs just arrive and you have to pay them. We're doing an extension of the model where the health shock occurs and you kind of discover what it's going to cost you to get treated. And then you have three options. You can not get treated, in which case your health will deteriorate as a result. It will deteriorate more, right? So that introduces an aspect of investment into the model. So people are going to be making decisions whether or not to get treated for shocks that occur. And if they don't choose to get treated, their consumption will go up, but as a result, their health will deteriorate more, right? So that introduces an investment aspect in health. They're also going to have an option to get treated and default on the bill, right? which happens in the US. And in that case, they're going to pay a cost for that default. It'll impact their ability to borrow in the future, and we'll probably have to have a stigma cost attached to defaulting in order to fully capture it. But I can't answer all of your questions in this time frame. But I think that I think that investment aspect we're going to be introducing there is probably my best response to your overall point.
So thanks a lot. We really have to move on now. So we'll coffee in the break before the next. So thanks again, Mike. And
thanks, everyone.
It was very, very interesting. I now give the floor to David, who's right here.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So let's get started right away. My name is David Koll, and today I'm going to present a joint paper with Dominik Sachs, Fabian Stuermer-Heiber, and Helene Turon on the equity and efficiency of childcare subsidies, a structural approach. And obviously, every feedback is very much welcome because we're in the process of kind of writing the first final draft. So what this paper is about. So first of all, there are a few papers that are evaluating childcare policies, specifically a paper by Garcia Hackman, Hendren, Kaiser, where they're looking at the implementation of childcare policies for very targeted groups, and they find high self-financing rates. In addition, there's also some further more mixed evidence for the fiscal cost of a universal program. So which programs, like childcare programs, which are not targeted to specific groups. But this is all about the implementation of such a childcare program. What we do in our paper is that we evaluate a universal childcare program with a structural model in 3 different ways, and we focus on changes in maternal labor supply and on the dynamic wage effect. So basically, you can think about like childcare enables women to go back to work earlier, and therefore they end up in completely different career paths. And that's what we kind of capture here with those dynamic wage effects, basically a human capital channel. And we do 3 different exercises. The first exercise is very similar to what I just described. So it's about an implementation of a program. So in Germany, between 2005 and 2012, there was an expansion of childcare for children between 0 to 2 in West Germany. And what we do here is where we look at this expansion and look at how self-financing this expansion of public childcare was. So you can think about this as a movement from a rationed environment to a non-rationed environment by increasing the number of subsidized childcare slots. In the second exercise, we're looking at what's happening now if we are in a non-rationed environment, as we are right now, if we are increasing the subsidy. So what's happening to female labor supply, what's happening to tax revenues in the future, and how much of the subsidies that the government has to actually invest into making those slots cheaper, how much of the subsidies are actually regained through current and future tax revenues from those working mothers. And the last exercise is then looking at how should, in a current environment, how should those subsidies actually vary with income? So what kind of equity efficiency trade-off is there? And what we do is that we calculate the efficiency costs of redistribution first for the childcare fee schedule and then also for the tax schedule. And this allows us to compare what are the costs of redistribution within the childcare fee schedule and also within the tax schedule. Having said that, so what is the key challenge here is that we have to understand if there's a policy change, which mothers in this setup react, and in which way they react. And what we do about this is that we set up a structural life cycle model with female labor supply and domestic childcare provision. And we allow for heterogeneity in wages, so female and male wages, because we only focus on couples where the partner, so the male is always working full-time, which is pretty close to the German environment. We allow for very detailed family composition, so we allow for up to 3 children with different timings, which will be exogenous in our model, and we allow for 2 different education levels. We qualify our model for Germany using the current policies. And one key ingredient is that we allow for rich unobserved heterogeneity. So the taste for domestic childcare is the first unobserved heterogeneity. Furthermore, we have an availability of informal childcare, and finally also taste for leisure. We estimate this distribution, which will be a continuous joint distribution. We estimate this using maximum likelihood with German panel data. And this distribution will be an important object because this distribution will determine, together obviously with the distribution of observed heterogeneity, will determine a lot the return to the government, and because it will determine how those mothers will actually react in response to the policy reforms. So let me give you a brief preview of the results. I'm sorry that you can't see the header up there. So this is kind of a brief preview of the results. So the first exercise, as I mentioned earlier, was the expansion of childcare. So now mothers are less, or households are less rationed. So they are able to kind of buy market childcare at a subsidized price. Whenever I talk about market childcare or public childcare, it's the same in Germany because there is basically no market for childcare besides the publicly provided and subsidized childcare. So focusing on this exercise here, this expansion, what we find is that this expansion more or less paid for itself. So in our current estimation, we find that 103% of the subsidies are actually regained through current and future tax revenues. And about 1/3 of this is actually coming from this dynamic wage effects. So you can think about that because those mothers work today, they are in a different career path, they pay higher taxes in the future, and this amounts to 1/3 of the subsidies that are paid to the mothers due to this reform. In contrast to that, if we look at the current schedule and we kind of change childcare prices in the current schedule, we only find that this policy would be 6% self-financing. So where is this big difference coming from? So in the first exercise, you can think about like households where the mother would like to work, but they can't work because there's no childcare available. And then those mothers actually start buying childcare, they go to work. So this is kind of this is a very targeted exercise in this sense, and a very targeted policy. The second policy, there basically we give everybody, though this policy gives everybody 50 euros who already is buying childcare. So these people just say, ah, nice, I take the 50 euros, put them in my pocket. So we call those people inframarginous because they don't change their behavior, right? And therefore, the cost of this policy is very large, and you only have very few who want to start, who actually start buying childcare and start working, right? So the tax revenues in the second exercise are also not high enough to kind of subsidize this very, very large mass of inframarginal mothers. So that's the big difference between those two policies. And then in the final exercise, we are looking at the evaluation of the childcare fee system versus the tax system. So here the question is, how much should those childcare subsidies or the childcare fees in some sense vary with income? And what we find is that the marginal redistribution, so in our exercise, the marginal excess burden, so if you can think about this exercise, we're looking at those above median income. We take away 1 euro from those above median income. How much reaches those below median income? That's the exercise what we're doing. And there's a concept called Okun's leaky bucket. So you basically go to the ones above median, you take 1 euro, you go to the ones below median, and there's like something lost along the way due to behavior changes. And in the German tax system, 29 cents are lost when you go to the above median incomes, and you can only give 71, so 1 minus 29, 71 cents to those below median income. If you do the same in the childcare fee system, actually 82 cents reach the ones below median income. And what we conclude from this is that if the government, because you can, like following a paper by Sachs and Stancheva, you can basically look at this the cost of redistribution. They tell you something about the implicit welfare waste that the government is having on the groups of above median and below median income households, right? So, but because this is different, it seems that either the government is kind of evaluating those groups differently between the tax schedule and the childcare fee schedule, or thinking about it in a different way. If the government would value the redistribution within the childcare fee system the same way as in the tax system, then the childcare fee system in Germany should become more progressive. So high-income people should pay more themselves, and low-income people should pay less in the childcare fee system. That's what's coming out of our comparison of those two systems. Okay. Let me jump right into the model because I want to give you like the last intuition again at the very end of the talk, and I want to get there. So the model is very simple. So we have a life cycle model between age 20 to 80 with 3-year model period. We have a household with 2 adults up to 3 kids. There is a discrete labor supply choice with no participation, part-time work or full-time work, and there's a domestic childcare choice. We have observed states, which are the age of both partners, male and female wages, which are modeled as Markovian processes, conditional on not working, part-time working, and full-time working. Obviously, the condition on working only applies to women because men always work full-time, but those Markov processes are also conditional on gender. And this is also where the learning by doing, so the human capital accumulation actually comes in a very reduced form. And then we have the family composition, KT, which is comprising the age and the number of children. And this is modeled as an exogenous stochastic process, conditional on maternal age and education, obviously also on the number of kids and the age of the kids present. And then finally, we have our unobserved heterogeneity, denoted by age, which comprises the domestic childcare preferences, the availability of informal other childcare, and the leisure preferences alpha. So just briefly on childcare, so there are time requirements conditioned on the age brackets. So if the child is between 0 to 5, the child has to be taken care of for 40 hours. The child is between 6 to 8, the child has to be taken care of for 15 hours because the remaining time is compulsory schooling time. What we do is for children 3 to 5, we assume that that child in that age bracket goes to kindergarten for at least 20 hours because we observe 95% of kids in that age bracket in Germany going to kindergarten, and that makes the model easier. So that's kind of an imposed choice for that age bracket. And then we, just to summarize the provision and the cost of childcare, first there's the domestic childcare, which obviously is for free. Then there's informal childcare by grandparents or neighbors. We also assume that this is for free. And we have the market, or call it public childcare, which is priced dependent on income, family size, and child age, which is exactly done like this in Germany. This is specifying the flow utility. Let's first focus on this this very large bracket. First very large bracket was the alpha. So this is basically the alpha here is giving you the relative preference between consumption and leisure. So this is our taste for leisure, right? And we assume CRA utility functional forms for consumption C, but also for leisure L. And there's a baseline leisure L bar entering the utility function. And then we also have in addition utility derived from domestic childcare, which is the last big bracket called DCC. There's also a baseline of DCC bar given to every household. And then the unobserved heterogeneity G, so the preference for domestic childcare, is basically giving is basically relative to the consumption leisure component. And we do one more change, which is one more additional assumption, which is that we assume that this preference G is shifted down by kappa if the child is above 3. So basically, if your child is below 3, you value spending time with your child more than if your child is above 3, which we think is natural and also allows us to match the data better. The dynamic problem is very simple because the only, like really the true only aspect in here which kind of makes this dynamic is the effect that the labor supply has an effect on future wages, right? Which comes in right here at the top, that the value function actually depends on LMT, right? So that's kind of the important part here. So you can basically say, okay, we look at the 3 different labor supply choices, and conditional on those labor supply choices, the choice for domestic childcare is a static choice in every period. And then, I mean, the time constraint is just given by you spend time on labor supply, LM, on leisure, L, or on DCC. The budget constraint, as we assume no savings, is that consumption is equal to the expenditure on childcare. Expenditure, I mean, the household gross income is just the labor supply of both partners, where we assume that males are working full-time. And childcare expenditures, as we allow up to 3 kids. Here, the price of childcare P is entering, which depends on the age of the child, which is here denoted by I. And then on the household, basically siblings, structure, KT, and YT gross is the gross income, and market childcare obviously multiplied. And in the very last row, that's where the assumption about kindergarten enters, that children between 3 to 5 at least go to kindergarten 20 hours. So let me be quick on the quantification to still have some time on the results. So we do this in 2 steps. The first step is that we do some auxiliary regressions and government policies. We estimate the wage process with a log normal estimation and then discretize it into a Markov process. We estimate the fertility process in a non-parametric way using German microcensus data, so quite a lot of observations to make sure that all our states have enough observations. And then we kind of move on to government policies, and then I will tell you a little bit about structural estimation. So we calibrate some parameters and the maximum likelihood estimation. So the government policies here are, first we estimate the childcare price schedule separately by child age, condition on household income and household income times siblings. Then we take taxes and transfers from a paper from BIC and co-authors, and the childcare costs are taken from government reports from federal statistics. But they're quite important because they determine at the end of the day the subsidy level. To take a step back here to be kind of precise, so what we're doing is we are calibrating some moments. For those calibrated moments, we're running our maximum likelihood estimation, and then we're checking how well are our calibrated moments fitting the targets that are written down here, which are, first of all, labor supply elasticity, so participation elasticity and an aggregate hours elasticity. Then in total, 12 different moments on labor market outcomes by the age of the youngest child, and in total like 9 moments for total market childcare shares by the age of the youngest child. So you can think about this calibration as more or less being an outer loop, and in the inner loop we will do the maximum likelihood estimation of the unobserved heterogeneity, which I will talk about next. So because, as I mentioned earlier, our object of interest is this distribution of unobserved heterogeneity, because this will, at the end of the day, determine very much which mothers are marginal and are inframarginal in our setup. So how mothers respond to those policy changes. And this object of interest, so this calligraphic h of x, is conditional on some constant characteristics x. So basically we allow those distributions of unobserved heterogeneity to be different, conditional on some characteristics, which I will explain in a second. We use 2 periods, so we use this German panel data, especially here observed individual choices on labor market and on the market childcare. And we assume that market childcare and wages are observed with measurement error. We make an assumption that the marginal distributions of those 3 unobserved heterogeneities, that they are independent. I mean, and but there will still be some correlation, because if we assume that those marginal distributions contain the same covariates x, then there will be some correlation through having the same covariates in those 3 different marginal distributions. And then we assume that the data generating process underlying this is a normal distribution, and we will finally come to the situation where we estimate at the end of the day those parameters gamma, beta, and sigma for the three different unobserved heterogeneity types. So these parameters are what we're estimating at the end of the day, and they will give us the joint distribution of unobserved heterogeneity. We'll do this with German data with subwaves after 2012, because before 2012 there was this expansion and we want to be in a kind of steady policy environment. We mapped this into two model periods and focusing only on married women with one child and at most 3 kids, which ends up with like about 2,000 individuals, of which 1,000 individuals have a child below 9. And maybe just a quick word on the constant characteristics. This is kind of led by 2 different ideas. The first idea is that there might be some initial conditions. I mean, we know that from the paper from Jerome Adler that possibly also the choice of education is kind of correlated or kind of affects or is affected by the preference to spend time with your children. So that's why we add skilled occupation to kind of take this into account. And we also try to kind of take into account that there are some implicit preferences or differences in preferences in the German population, for example, with Catholic or East. And this kind of could, for example, change the preference for domestic childcare, that those people differ in this respect. Let me briefly tell you how we think about identification, because we don't have a formal proof on this, but obviously the panel structure of the data will help us a lot in identification on top of the assumptions that we're making. So first of all, kind of this panel structure allows to disentangle wage shocks from permanent unobserved heterogeneity. In addition, there will also be some changes in the family composition, which also will allow us to kind of estimate or identify our unobserved heterogeneity in a good way. In addition, we will also have women without any children. So this will help us a lot to kind of get the identification of the leisure component, which will then also help to identify those who currently have children, because the leisure component will be strongly identified by those who don't have children. So this interaction is, from our point of view, very helpful to get identification here. Okay. Let me maybe be super brief on the model fit, because how much time do I have left? 15 minutes. Okay. Are there any questions? Because I think I went quite fast on model and quantification. Okay. Okay, very good. Because briefly on the model fit, I think by now our model fit is doing fairly nice. We're still a bit off in terms of the part-time and full-time margin for older kids, and underestimating no participation a bit for the youngest, and overestimating full-time for the youngest. But we kind of get this broad break between younger kids and older kids quite well. If we look at the fit of the total market childcare, here we're looking at 3 different bins. The first bin is below the 33rd percentile. The largest bin is above the 75th percentile. And also here we kind of get those breaks in the data pretty nicely. I mean, you need to take into account that the model predicts a 0 share for children 3 to 5 below n-bar 1 is just coming by assumption, because we basically send them to childcare for 20 hours by model assumption. But that assumption helps here a lot to kind of get this change also in the data, what we observe. So that's why we think it's reasonable. Okay, and maybe one word on the implied elasticities. Here there's still some work to be done, but what we currently find is that our compensated intensive margin elasticity is 0.17, and our compensated extensive margin elasticity is 0.15. I mean, if we compare them, for example, to this overview article by Raschetti in the AER Papers and Proceedings, they're more on the lower side of their range, but they're more or less still in the range. And we have to also take into account that these are married mothers in Germany, but they're rather low compared to other estimates in the literature. That's our current understanding of this. So let me maybe, so when we talk about policy experiments, so let me remind you, the first policy experiment was about the lifting of rationing in Germany. And our setup, I mean, let's put it this way. This is the policy experiment where our model is not super well suited to cover this because we need to do an additional change in our framework. So we need to modify our framework, because if we don't, we would overestimate our effect, in the sense that our model is not able to predict a low share of market childcare take-up before this reform and a high share of mothers working. So what we do to overcome this is that we do an implementation of this modified framework that we allow a fallback option of informal childcare in this pre-reform world. So we basically allow them that they use another 17.5 hours per week of informal childcare before this expansion, which allows us to match the employment share of mothers with 0 to 2-year-old children in 2005 to which was about 30%. In addition, we include a rationing probability. So basically, mothers were rationed with a probability of 85%. And this allows us to match the very low share of mothers or of children who go to childcare at that time. What's important for us is that when we do this exercise, we are very close to what reduced form studies find who evaluate a very similar reform. So Bauernschuster and Schlotter look at a reform at the early 2000s, late 90s, and they also find that about 40% of mothers who start using public childcare also start working. What we find is 45%. So this kind of tells us that we're in the ballpark of what one would have expected from this reform. But also note that all this kind of stuff, we wouldn't really need a structural model to do this. We could also say, okay, the Bauernschuster paper, Bauernschuster-Schlotter paper is nice. We take the 40%. We just assume that's the evolution of wages in the future, and then we get like a very similar result to what we are getting. So the true strength of our structural model will come up in the next exercise. But let me tell you briefly how we think about this self-financing degree that we are focused on and what I told you earlier about. So the self-financing degree here is nothing else than what is the change in taxes over the change in subsidies. So what is the share that the government can refinance itself through increased tax revenues? And we do this for two different time horizons. First, an impact period, so just looking at this one period of implementation, and then looking at all future periods as well, because only if we look at all future periods, we will also get the dynamic wage effect, and we'll be able to take this into account. If we do this, looking only at the impact period, we'll find an effect of 71%. If we look at all periods, 71% means that 71% of the subsidies are regained through higher tax revenues. The 103% I mentioned earlier is coming if we look over the entire life cycle of our sample. And then we find that this policy has been self-financing. But it could also very well be that it was like 90% or 110%. I think there is some uncertainty on this estimate at the end of the day. But I want to give you a bit of intuition on where this comes from. So here there are like 3 different groups. Let's only focus on the first 2 because we can split up and we can decompose the tax effect and the subsidy effect. And the tax effect here is only coming from those who actually start working more and use more childcare, which is the first group on the horizontal axis, right? So those are the marginal mothers, what we call marginal because they're marginal in the labor supply decision. So if you spend €1 to those, they give you €1.15 in return. The problem is that then there are also some others who start using childcare, but they don't start working. So the government also has to spend 62%. If they give €1 to the marginals, they have to give 62 to the non-marginals. And that's why we end up at 71%, because if you stack the 2 red bars over each other, the blue bar is just 71% of the red bar. If we go one step further and say now we are in this non-ration environment and we look at a change in the childcare subsidies. So basically everybody gets 50 euros. If you, I mean, or for everybody, the childcare gets 50 euros cheaper. Let's put it this way. We actually find here, if we do this in an untargeted way, that if we only focus on the impact period, it only refinances by 4%. If we look at all periods, it refinances by 6%. Why is those numbers so low? Especially also if we compare to kind of a full-time work contingent policy, which refinances itself by 33% in the impact period and 50% if we look at the entire life cycle. We can look at the same graphs as before, right? So if we give €1 to the marginal ones in the setup of untargeted childcare subsidies, this is the €1 at the very first group. So the labor supply increases due to, in that group, due to the additional 50 euros, they give €1.69 in return. So there is a return on this group. They are refinancing themselves. The problem is that there's a very large group which doesn't change the labor supply. Some of them even increase their market childcare, which is the second red bar, and the government has to pay them €9.49 if they pay €1 to those at the margin. And then in addition, there are even those who don't even change their market childcare behavior, and the government has to give them 31 euros, right? So this is just lost money because those people don't change their behavior. And that explains why this reform is so extremely costly, because there's this large group of inframarginals that just take the 50 euros and walk away. We can do this and look at this also for full-time work contingent policies. And here we see that the group of inframarginals is getting a lot smaller, right? Because this reform is like very much targeted to those who work full-time. And the group of full-time working mothers is very small. Therefore, we have like a lot smaller group of inframarginals, and it amounts only to 4.92 euros. In addition, we also see that the effects actually get larger for those who actually start working. So now they repay about 2 euros for every euro they receive. But still, even if the reform is full-time work contingent, we see that those childcare subsidies, they don't completely pay for themselves. Okay, but now I have like probably 5 more minutes left or something to actually tell you about the redistribution and our evaluation of redistribution within the childcare system. So the current childcare fee schedule in Germany actually entails some redistribution, right? Because this childcare fee schedule is already progressive, right? So the government is already using some redistributive mechanism in there. So what we're asking now is, like, looking at this current schedule, what are the efficiency costs of redistribution which are associated with this existing progressive childcare fee schedule? And how we do about this is, like, we are looking at the marginal excess burden. So we're looking at, for every dollar, as I mentioned earlier, for every dollar taken away from those above median income, how much is lost along the way before the money is redistributed to those below median income. And that's the marginal excess burden here. And all this is coming due to behavioral changes of both groups, right? Even the below median income households, they will also change their behavior in terms of market childcare, but also labor supply. And I will go more into detail later. This is just an implementation of how we're doing this. So we're basically tweaking the tax schedule and also the market childcare schedule for those above median income, and increasing what the tax rate they have to pay on the amount of income above the median income, and then choosing the decreasing tax rate for those below median income accordingly to have a balanced budget. So this is just an implementation, and we do this separately for the taxes and for the market childcare, and then evaluate both reforms separately. Probably easier to see in this graph, because this is exactly the reform that we're doing for the childcare schedule. Here you see that the marginal or the efficient margin tax rate is getting steeper, right? And the price of market childcare is increasing for those above median income and is decreasing for those below median income. What we find, and I alluded to this earlier, is that the marginal excess burdens for the tax schedule are about 29%, or if you think about this, 29 cents if you redistribute €1, or if you take €1 from the top. And they're about 18 cents if you take €1 from the top through the margin, through the childcare fee schedule. So we were a bit surprised by this large difference, and we wanted to understand where is this coming from. But first of all, of course, it's pretty clear what this results in are, right? I mean, like the childcare fee schedule has a lower efficiency cost of redistribution. And then the next step is like, as I said earlier, is like building a bit on the idea of like Sachs and Stuermer-Heiber is saying that if the government has the same desire to redistribute within the childcare fee schedule as it has within the population that is facing the tax schedule, then these childcare fees, they should be made more progressive. But giving you an idea about where does this efficiency cost come from? So where's the mechanism? So the first thing here is that note that here, by making these schedules steeper, and this is done for the tax schedule and the market childcare, the childcare fee schedule. So by making these steeper, the effective marginal tax rates increase. And this decreases labor supply, but this decreases labor supply for all income levels because the effective marginal tax rate decreases for all groups. And that's actually true for the childcare fee schedule and for the tax schedule. But the next two effects are only true for the childcare fee schedule, and that's where the differences are mostly coming from, because there is a change in the level of the monthly childcare fee, right? And this implies that the option between not working and working, so the return between those two options actually changes, because you can decide now, like this childcare fees, they get more expensive for the above median income people. And they could say, okay, now I stop working, because now actually, if I stop working, this schedule doesn't apply to me anymore. And that's not happening with the tax schedule. And that's a big difference here, right? And that's implying that the labor supply, there will be a positive labor supply effect for those below median income, so where the green line is, because their absolute price actually decreased. So their option between not working and working is actually improving the work option. And for those above median income is actually a further decrease of the labor supply. There's an additional effect that by changing the market childcare, because what can you do? Like if you think about a situation where a mother is working part-time before and after, just focusing on market childcare, then what you can do by buying market childcare, you're effectively buying leisure, right? So if market childcare gets cheaper, in this sense, leisure actually gets cheaper. So you might, so the relative price between leisure and spending time with your child changes, which implies that for those below median income, they will actually start enjoying more leisure and increase their use of public childcare. And for the ones above median income, it's actually decreasing. So I think I should slowly come to an end, because we have a nice decomposition, and these are kind of our brand new results, because we can decompose those 29 cents into 11 cents of a decrease of labor supply in the tax schedule for those below median income, and 18 cents are lost because the above median income decreased their labor supply. And if we compare this with the childcare fee schedule, we see that these 11 cents, they decrease to only 1.6 cents. And there's even like some people joining in and increasing their labor supply due to the second effect that I told you earlier. And when we look at the situation where labor supply is unchanged and market childcare is changed, we see that there are more below median income who increase their market childcare to consume leisure than people above median income to decrease their leisure. This actually imposes an additional marginal excess burden, or part of the marginal excess burden, for the childcare fee schedule of 4.4 cents. So we do one more adjustment of the reform, but I think I'm running out of time. So this should be the childcare fee schedule if it had the same cost of redistribution as the tax schedule. So basically like the green and orange line. So a lot more progressive. And this is where I want to end. So basically, we find that the childcare fee reform in Germany was fully self-financing. A further untargeted increase in the current generous level of childcare fees would only be 6% self-financing. And we find that the childcare fee schedule implies substantially lower efficiency costs of redistribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So John had a couple of questions regarding to what extent you could use the model in order to model things like family leave policies, or maybe trying to change the incentives of the husband taking time off work to take care of the kids.
So I think, I mean, the second one, I can make my life easy, probably. I think that's a different paper. I would love to write that one. Probably, I think it would make this problem, I think it would change it substantially, because then we would also need to have something like how to determine this, how to kind of evaluate, like basically preferences also for the husband or for the household to have this sharing. Could be because of preferences, could be because of wages. I think that would be very much also in the spirit of what Michel Tertil in Mannheim is working on, where I'm now. So it could be that I'm going to write a paper on this. I'm not sure if I think I can't convince my co-authors to build this in here. The first question, I forgot.
Well, pretty much the same direction, no? So childcare leave policies.
Yeah, childcare leave policies.
Paying the husband to take work off.
Yeah, I mean, childcare leave policies are kind of working against our argument here, right? Because it's, I mean, in Germany right now, mostly like almost everybody is basically taking like childcare leave policies, and they're very unequally distributed between men and women. So it's like almost always that women are taking like the larger share, and most of the time like 1 year. So that's something we kind of abstract from in our model, because it would like first, we think that for the dynamic evolution, it's not that important. And on a 3-year horizon, it's not making so much of a difference. And it would require another state variable. I mean, in front of a structured crowd, I can also say that. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. There was one more question on come on, Thomas, on the gender of the child based on my anecdotal evidence in childcare centers. I would discard that for Germany as being relevant, but David can answer it as in Zulip as whether it's important in the model. Thomas, floor is yours. Let me just try to get your slides on.
So what I'll be talking about is joint work with Katrine Jakobsen and Hamish, both from Oxford, and I can see Hamish is here. So I'll be talking about fertility and labor supply. So this is very much work in progress. So we're also trying to finalize the first final draft of this paper. So all comments are really welcome. So I put up my email address here. So if you have any thoughts, comments, whatever, please do reach out and we can take a Zoom or whatever you want to do. Okay, so maybe I don't need to say that here, but understanding labor supply is sort of key to understanding sort of key concepts in policy, okay? So what has been shown primarily by Michael Keane and co-authors is that human capital is quite important to understand sort of dynamic labor supply over the life cycle. Other researchers has also argued that fertility is likely also important and interlinked with labor supply. Okay, so for example, market work might be less desirable when you have children. For example, that's a key thing. What we want to go after here is, so we just saw a really interesting presentation before about childcare costs and childcare availability, and there's sort of a literature looking into that, but we'll sort of come from another angle and think about how does fertility affect labor supply responses to, let's say, taxes or in general wages. Okay, so that's sort of the thing that you should think about here. Okay, so the idea is that if you change the tax schedule, that changes sort of the desire to work, but it might also change the desire to have more or fewer children. Okay, so that's sort of the area we're in and what we're working at the moment. Okay, so existing literature tends to sort of focus on childcare costs, and the existing literature sort of developing models in this area typically either focus on men or females. So we want to sort of focus on couples because most sort of working age individuals, when they have their children, are living in couples. Okay, so that's what we want to focus on here. So the core trade-off I want you to think about is sort of fertility and labor supply within families. Okay, so that's what we want to do. The paper sort of has two main pillars. So first, we want to motivate empirically why we think it's sort of relevant to think about endogenous fertility responses to wage changes, for example. So the way that we do that here is that we employ Danish data together with an exogenous variation in the tax schedule due to tax reforms in 2009, 2010. So we want to show empirically that actually both labor supply and fertility can respond to these types of reforms. Then what we want to do subsequently is to quantify sort of the dynamic trade-offs between working more or less and having more or less children, okay, from reforms like this. How important is it actually to have these fertility responses? Okay, so if you think about what I just said before, that if you change sort of the tax schedule, it might have some effects on fertility that has a feedback effect on labor supply. To this end, we'll build sort of a dynamic life cycle model with labor supply of both men and women, with human capital accumulation of both these household members, with endogenous fertility, I mean, the number of timing of children, and wealth accumulation. Okay, so that's sort of what I'll go through quickly today. So let me just show you the results if I don't manage. So what we find is in this reform, I'll show you in a minute, is that both labor market participation and the number of children increase when we reduce marginal tax rates. Okay, so I'll discuss this more in a minute. And then what we find from the structural part of the paper is that when we simulate sort of different sort of reforms, we also find an important role of this feedback mechanism from fertility to labor supply in the structural model. But as I said, this is work in progress. So what I think I will do today is I'll talk about these results, but I sort of targeted to this very highly selected audience. So I'll talk a little bit about the model and how we do it and what we do, more than necessarily what we actually find. But I'll get back to that when we get there. Okay, so there's a huge literature in this. So I was lucky enough to see some of the really inspiring student presentations in the summer school yesterday, very creative research questions. And I'm a little bit sad that I'm talking about sort of a research project here that's really, really old. So many people have worked on stuff like this. And I don't have time to list all the references, but some of the key references are here. Okay. So let me jump into the empirical motivation. So what we do here is that we combine sort of several Danish registers, combining a panel from 2003 to 2017, where we can link all household members with their children and combine information on wealth, income, fertility, and stuff like that. Okay, so what we'll be doing is then we'll focus on not self-employed and non-students, and focus on people in the sort of fertile age when we look at this reduced form results. Okay, so it's the similar type of data that we'll use when we estimate the model. I'll talk a bit more about that when I get there. Then what we have sort of got access to is a detailed tax simulator from Denmark, such that we can construct tax instruments, mechanical tax changes on the individual and household level. Okay, so we'll use that. So the identification strategy in this first part of the paper, how do we identify the causal effect of marginal wage changes on labor supply and fertility, is sort of summarized in this graph here. Okay, so what I have on the x-axis are average taxable income from the years 2007 and 2008. Maybe you can see I have plotted sort of ingratiated the distribution of income in Denmark. And on the y-axis, I have the marginal tax rate in 3 different years. So in the dark blue is 2008, and the light blue is 2009, and the red is 2010. And the main identification strategy that we apply here is basically we focus on a narrow sort of set of people who are just around the bottom tax cutoff in 2007 and 2008. Okay, so the control group is just to the left of this cutoff, and the treatment group is just to the right of that cutoff. Okay. So that's basically what we'll zoom in on here. Okay, so we are thinking about this as a sort of intention to treat. Okay, so people in the treatment group is likely to experience a 6 percentage point further reduction in the marginal tax rate compared to the control group. So that's roughly a 40% increase in the net of tax rate. Okay. What I show here is then the dynamic intention to treat responses here from this sort of reduced form setup. It's on the left panel, I show the labor market participation, whether you participate in the labor market or not. And on the right panel, I show sort of the likelihood of giving birth to an additional child. Okay. And we see on the left panel that labor market participation goes up. And we see on the right panel that also fertility increases slightly. Okay. So what we find is if we sort of try to calculate sort of a fertility elasticity here, that is around sort of 0.7 or something like that. Okay. So this number is basically what we will use sort of to validate our model later on. Okay. So this is sort of the empirical motivation for why do we want to build a model to try to understand this. So let me go through the life cycle model. I just need to see. So let me put up sort of the state variables and control variables here. I would love to show Bellman equations, but I don't think it's too sort of enlightening. So I'll just sort of go through step by step large parts of the model. So the state variables in this model are the human capital of both men and women. So that's capital K. The wealth accumulation, that's A, the number of children, and the age of the youngest child. Okay, so we only keep track of the age of the youngest child here. The choice variables are consumption, fertility effort, E, and labor supply of both men and women. So labor supply here, as we have seen that Mike Keane did as well, is that we sort of separate this into three sort of alternatives. Okay, so you can choose not to work, you can work part-time, or you can work full-time. And that's the same for both men and women. The human capital accumulation is actually also quite standard and similar to what Mike showed you. So human capital evolves sort of in the next period, there's a depreciation of your current level of human capital. Then you gain some more human capital if you work. And then there's a multiplicative log normal mean one shock to human capital. Okay, so that's sort of a persistent shock in this model. And there's a shock to both men and women here. Then labor income, capital Y, is given as the wage rate times the labor supply, where these sort of annualized wage rates follow a simple sort of Mincer type relationship, where log wages are constant plus some effect from human capital accumulation. Okay, and fertility in this model. So what I just showed you is relatively standard in this sort of types of models. And now I'm going to discuss a little bit how we build in fertility in this. So we take the approach of imperfect fertility control. So what do I mean by that? I mean that households choose fertility effort. Okay, so E is a binary variable that's equal to 1 if the household tries to conceive a child. The likelihood of a childbirth in the next period is then given sort of as what I write up here, depending on whether you supply effort or not. So if you try to get pregnant, there's a probability script P that's less than 1 that the child will arrive. So you should think about this as a biological fecundity that's declining in age. Okay, so in this model, when people are 47 or something like that, you cannot have any more children. So this is sort of declining in age. But you can still sort of experience a childbirth in the next period, even if you are not trying to conceive a child. So even if your effort is 0, there's still some probability that you get pregnant and the child will arrive. Okay, so that's the red underbar script P here. That's sort of greater than 0. That sort of gives you these unintended pregnancies. So what we're trying to do here is sort of combining sort of a relatively realistic fertility model with a relatively realistic model of household labor supply. Okay. Then when households reach a certain age, children start to move out stochastically. So they disappear again, but they do that probabilistically. Okay, so another thing that's probabilistic is partnership dissolution. So one problem when we want to sort of think about households here is how do they mate and how do they break up? So we do it quite simple here. People sort of, you should think of it as people start together in a couple, and then they, as time progresses, there's some random risk of divorcing or partnership dissolution, and that's absorbing here. So we don't model remarriage, for example. The same with retirement, so that's exogenous and it's also absorbing. Then we have sort of an involuntary unemployment risk of 3% per year. Okay, and then sort of a lot of effort within here to try to implement relatively parsimonious yet rich descriptions of the Danish system in which these agents are going to live in. Okay, so what we have implemented is the labor income tax system, sort of basically mimicking what I just showed you in a reduced form before. We have unemployment transfers, childcare costs, child benefits, and then we also implement sort of a parsimonious parental leave sort of system. In the model, all this leave is taken by mothers. Okay. So let me just briefly show you the household preferences. We are a structural crowd, so we can handle a utility function. So what I have here is sort of the household preferences. Is sort of we take a simple unitarian framework where we weight the utility of the women and men by lambda and 1 minus lambda respectively. Okay. Individual preferences are a sum of several components. So let me briefly talk about it. The first part you see here is just the standard CRRA utility function as a function of consumption, where we normalize consumption with this equivalent scale, OECD standard type of stuff. Thing is this nu of n. The next part, the sum from 1 to in upper bar, is basically the value of children. Okay, so we want to estimate sort of a model where both the labor supply and people have children endogenously, right? So they need to have some value of getting these children. Otherwise, why would they want to do it? And these parameters in omega here is what we're going to estimate to capture the realized fertility. Then finally, in the function Q down here that I've left out is a relatively flexible specification of the value of supplying labor interacted with the number of children and the age of the youngest child. Okay, so the last part down here is going to capture sort of these interaction effects. Maybe you dislike working when you have a young child, for example. That's sort of what should be captured in this Q down here. So we are still sort of trying to mess around with this and sort of find specifications that we feel is sort of rich enough. Okay, so now I reached the sort of the shameless self-promotion slide. But let me talk briefly about how we estimate this model. So if you've seen the 2 other presentations, I think they did exactly the same. So it's a common theme. We have this 2-step estimation procedure. In the first step, we calibrate some of the model parameters that we are not going to estimate from the literature or in a first step estimation. So for example, we fixed the discount factor at 0.97 and the risk aversion coefficient at 1.5. And then what we then do is that we investigate sort of how sensitive are our results to sort of these first step calibrations. And that's due to one of my own papers, so you should look at that. Then in the second step, we estimate the remaining parameters in data. Okay, so that could, for example, be these omegas I talked about, these the value of the first, second, third child. It is this Q function and whatever, right? And we, as the rest, use a similar method of moments, okay, using the Danish data from 2010, i.e. after the tax reform, to estimate these parameters. Again, as you have seen, like we can talk about this identification stuff. What we do in this paper is we sort of investigate identification, or what we call informativeness, from including these sets of moments to see like what would happen if we were to exclude some of these moments. What would happen to our identification, loosely speaking. Okay, that's also based on a paper by me, so you should have a look at that as well, together with Bo Honoré and Aura Di Paula. Okay, so let me show you just briefly some of the moments that we fit. So there's a lot of moments, but these are some of them. They're not completely randomly picked, unfortunately, but so what I want to show you here is sort of some of them. So the first 2 top panels here are event study graphs around the birth of the first child. So if you have seen sort of work by Henrik Kleven and co-authors, you like to look at these child penalty graphs, right? So that's basically what you see here, where the left panel are for women and the right are for men. And you can see the blue dotted line are the simulated moments from the estimated model. So we fit the sort of the response of men and women quite well here. In the bottom, I show you sort of the number of children, the cumulative number of children in the data and in the model. So there's a question of why there's the up-down pattern. You mean in the data or in the simulation? In the simulation. So it's sort of like, so the down pattern comes again when people have more children, right? So that's also why it's a little bit pronounced in this particular simulation here. all of this will change because we're redoing it, but so that has to do with when this more children arrives. Yeah, good question. Okay, so maybe I can say something here. So for example, I think I have time. So we see that men don't really respond. So what you could think then is that men don't value leisure time when children are present, okay, because they don't really respond. But that's actually not the case, because if you think about it, you have two household members. Your wife decreases her labor supply. If you want to sort of maintain a consumption level, you would have to increase your labor supply, right? So in order to actually get that men do not increase their labor supply, they have to value leisure more when children arrive. Okay, so that's sort of a thing that sort of comes out of this. Okay, so let me speed up a bit. So what we want to do, as I promised you, that we sort of use this reduced form to sort of model validate a bit. So what I've shown you here is, I apologize for the scale, is sort of a simulation where we implement an unanticipated 5% permanent increase in the wages of women. Okay, we do that for when the women are 30 years old. Then what I plot here is the difference from the baseline number of children in percent. Okay, so what you can see is that there's an immediate increase in the number of children. Then it tapers off, and then in the end at completed fertility, there's not really a huge response anymore. Okay, so this is actually very much in line with what we find in our reduced form results, is that even if you increase wages, we can see that fertility goes up. We also have sort of reform effects looking at completed fertility. We don't find a huge effect there, a little bit like we show here. Okay, so this is sort of in line with our reduced form of results. What I want to talk about in the end is sort of like, I promised you that we wanted to sort of, in a sense, quantify this feedback mechanism between fertility and labor supply. So this is really what we can do with this model. For example, is we can sort of come up with all crazy kinds of counterfactuals. So let me go through how we try to quantify this. So to do it, we built a new model. So we have the baseline model where households choose fertility endogenously and labor supply. But in this exogenous fertility model that we're going to use to see like how different are the responses in this model, we let fertility be exogenous. So per definition, fertility cannot respond to labor to wage changes, right? It's fixed. So in this model, fertility is random. So all agents in the model have some beliefs about what's the likelihood of having another child, and we fix that belief exactly at what we simulated from the baseline model. Okay, so in the baseline model, we have this fertility arrival thing down in the bottom here. We fixed those. From that, we can calculate what's the probability of having one child, what's the probability of having a second child, giving I have one child, and all of that. So we use those child arrival probabilities when we simulate this exogenous fertility model. Hopefully that makes sense. And then when we simulate this alternative model, we actually keep the realized fertility completely fixed. So that means in these two simulations, from these two different models, households have the same number of children at the same time. Okay. So fertility is unchanged. And we do this to sort of really try to get out the labor supply differences in these two types of settings. Okay. So what we do the same thing again. We introduce a 5% permanent unanticipated wage increase of women. We calculate what is the elasticity if we introduce this wage increase at different points in life. We calculate the elasticity of completed fertility and labor market supply. And we do that in both models. And then what we want to do is we want to compare how do these elasticities differ across models, right? Because that's the idea here is that will tell us something about how important this feedback mechanism is. So that's what I show you here. So let me first start with the right hand panel. So the right hand panel here is the number of children. Well, the reason why I have it here is just to really hammer down that, in the exogenous fertility model, that's the dashed blue line. There's no change in fertility. Fertility cannot change. So that's just a straight line at 0. In the baseline model, fertility can change, right? It could go up, it can go down. And what we see is that, for example, if we increase wages at age 35, we see a relatively large increase in the completed fertility. So it's positive here. As we go, if we introduce the increase in wages at age, let's say 25, we see a smaller effect on fertility. We actually don't see any in this simulation. The reason for this is that if we introduce this wage increase so early, a lot of people can just really change their fertility a lot. So they can, for example, have no kids at all. And in this model, what drives this hump shaped here is that there's a huge difference between having the first child and the second child on your disutility from labor. Okay, so think about this. So you can imagine a model where what really matters for how much you prefer to work is if you have any children at all. Okay. And that's sort of what we have here, is like the effect on your labor supply from additional children is not that great in this situation here. So that means that if wages increase at age 35, I already have some kids. Why not have some more? Now I can afford it. That's the motivation here. And this is sort of really preliminary, because what I'm working on now is trying to kill this to make sure that this is sort of actually something that we believe in. Okay, but this is the result right now. What we have on the left panel, and that's basically the sort of currently what we're after in this paper, is basically what we see here. So what I show you here is the labor supply elasticities of men in blue and women in green, where the dashed lines again are in this exogenous fertility model. And actually what we see here is that the labor supply responses are larger when fertility is endogenous. Okay, so that the solid line is greater than the dashed line here. So I was a little bit surprised about that. And again, that's something that we're sort of working on to make sure that this is actually something that holds up. But basically you should think about it like, now I have more children, okay, because it doesn't matter too much for my disutility of work, because it's an extensive margin thing. I might work more to finance having these more children. Okay, so that's sort of what we're at right now. Okay. Yes. Okay. So what's really key here, and when you look at this video in many years, when this is hopefully published, if we have different results from this, is that in this model, there's a huge effect of the first child on your disutility of work, but not a large effect from having more children. Okay. So there's an extensive margin here, and that's what we're really trying to estimate currently. Okay, so my final slide, I have no idea on time, but what I think we sort of showed, and at least what we want to show in this paper, is sort of take seriously potential feedback effects from fertility on labor supply. Okay, so what we could also look into is, for example, in this model, we could also change childcare costs and all that stuff that we might do in the future. But currently, this is sort of what we're doing. And as I said, I'm currently estimating sort of an extended model to make sure that sort of this is actually something that we feel holds up. Okay, and all suggestions and anything are very welcome, because we are still drafting this. Okay, so that's all for me.
Yeah, so organizer-wise, I have to make 2 remarks. First, you forgot to 40 people to say, you can just talk to me over the next 1.5 days. We're almost forgetting about that possibility. The other thing is, thank you. You cut off 10 minutes, which you added to the break. But there could be more questions. So Hamish did, I think, a great job of answering some along the way. Then let me just run over to Eric, who's raising his hand in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to know a little bit more about taxation in Denmark. So I guess it's individual taxation. So it seems like, especially in both the structural model and the reduced form framework, there's a lot of variation that you can exploit, because I guess if we're thinking about a man being pushed up to a higher wage level through the tax reform, that's going to have very different impacts than if the woman is pushed into a different tax bracket, just because we can really separate out the income and substitution effects. And I guess that's going to be pretty important for thinking about this, which family member actually gets the wage increase. And
Yes, thanks. You are exactly right. So taxation is very much individual in Denmark, and we are working on sort of trying to sort of take this household thing more seriously when we think about the reduced form sort of changes and using the tax simulator more aggressively in that respect. So that's something that we want to look at it more, but I don't have results here on that. But yeah, thanks.
Hi, Chris, go ahead.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually confused because there's a paper by Vic and Fuchs Sundholm, which looks at how joint versus individual taxation explains labor supply differences of married women across countries. And they classify Denmark as a joint taxation country where married women face a high marginal rate. So unless there's been some reform since their paper, which was just a few years ago, I thought Denmark was a joint taxation country.
You know, yeah, so it's not anymore. The only jointness we have is that if one spouse is not working, you can transfer a deductible, but it's not a lot.
So really, so they've actually changed it. Okay, well, that's interesting. That gives you a good opportunity, doesn't it, to study the impact of that change?
Yeah, that's something. That's something we can look at. We are thinking about using earlier reforms. So the nice thing about this reform was that it's easy sort of graphically to show what happens. These earlier reforms, like there's a lot of stuff changing. So that's the reason why we. But initially, I that as well, and that's something that we intend to look more into. Yeah, thanks.
What I was going to say is that if you look at their paper, they show that the joint versus individual taxation explains a lot of the variation in married women's labor supply across countries, but they classify Denmark as a big outlier because they have it as the kind of the one outlier country where married women work a lot despite facing a high marginal rate due to this joint taxation that they used to face, right? And I was thinking that in your model, since you've got not just the income tax structure, but also other features like, I guess, subsidies to childcare and so on, you could try to investigate what caused Denmark to be an outlier by their standards. And that could also be very interesting.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll have to look at the paper again, but I think that's a good suggestion too.
Yeah, I mean, I can send it along to you, so you know.
Right. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I just remember there was one more question by Christian, which I'm not sure whether Hamish answered it, at least I didn't see it, which was on, you appear to set the human capital accumulation rate to 0.75 for part-time workers. And that seems to be relatively high relative to other estimates in the literature. If I think of the Blundell, Custodias et al. Paper.
Yeah, so that's right. So that's sort of quite arbitrary and something that we could try to maybe estimate or calibrate differently. It's motivated a little bit by the way that Statistics Denmark think about part-time work in Denmark. So it's sort of like, but yeah, that is quite arbitrary and something that we could, at least in a robustness sort of think about. But that's right. We put it at 0.75. Yeah.
Excellent. Anything else from the room? From the panelists, if you want, just jump in. Great, then thank you, Thomas, for, thank you in the name of everybody for extending the break from 10 to 15 minutes and the great paper. Thanks to all the speakers once more.